Prince William has finally drawn a line that nobody inside the palace expected him to cross. And it all began with an explosive confrontation involving Princess, and that turned an ordinary royal engagement into a crisis threatening to expose deep divisions within the family. What should have been a routine appearance quickly spiraled when Laura Lopes allegedly forced her way into a restricted area, confronted the Princess Royal, and delivered accusations that left witnesses completely stunned. Within moments, the atmosphere inside the venue changed. Security officers moved in, reporters began watching closely, and one photographer appeared to capture the confrontation from an unusually perfect position. But the confrontation itself was only the beginning. Behind the scenes, William was about to receive information that would transform a public embarrassment into something far more serious. Questions about who authorized Laura's access, why security failed, and what she allegedly confronted and about began spreading through palace circles. Then William saw the footage for himself. And according to the dramatic account that follows, his response was immediate. He wasn't prepared to simply contain the scandal. He was ready to investigate exactly how it happened, who was responsible, and whether this confrontation was part of something much bigger. And that's where everything changed. Princess Anne had barely reached the center of the exhibition hall when she noticed that something about the afternoon felt wrong. The event was supposed to be routine, another carefully organized appearance built around agriculture, rural communities, and the quiet responsibilities that have defined her public life for decades. Instead, an unfamiliar tension was spreading through the room. Staff members were exchanging quick glances, reporters were suddenly paying closer attention, and Laura Lopes was moving toward the Princess Royal with a determination that immediately changed the atmosphere. Laura stopped only a few steps away. She did not appear interested in making a polite introduction. She wanted answers. Her complaint centered on estate decisions and financial changes that she believed had damaged her family's position. The accusation was delivered openly, in front of people who had been expecting an ordinary royal engagement. And listened without interrupting, her expression remaining almost completely unreadable. That calmness made the confrontation even more uncomfortable. Rather than argue, Anne asked a simple question about how Laura had entered the restricted area. The question shifted the entire focus of the encounter. Suddenly, this was no longer only a family disagreement. It was a security problem. Laura continued speaking, insisting that the palace had been targeting her family and that senior officials knew more about the financial review than they were admitting. And finally signaled to her protection officer, who stepped between them and instructed Laura to leave the immediate area. The confrontation ended quickly, but the damage had already been done. Witnesses had seen it, reporters had heard it, and questions about Laura's access were already circulating. Within minutes, senior staff began checking the guest list and access records. Her name was not supposed to appear among the approved attendees. Someone had allowed her through a restricted route, and that meant somebody inside the system had made a decision that could not easily be explained away. The first review pointed toward a last-minute invitation connected to a regional official with links to people close to Camilla's household. The discovery immediately changed the palace's response. What had looked like an embarrassing confrontation now appeared to involve a serious failure of internal controls. Then the report reached Prince William. He was in the middle of another official discussion when the message arrived. He wanted every available record, including the security logs, witness statements, and footage of the confrontation. He understood that the real question was no longer what Laura had said. It was who had made it possible for her to say it there. The following morning, the atmosphere inside the palace had changed. Staff members who had treated the previous day's confrontation as an embarrassing family episode were now speaking about it as an institutional crisis. Meetings were being rearranged, access privileges were being reviewed, and senior officials were being questioned about decisions they had previously considered routine. And supported that approach. The pressure inside grew. William moved quickly once the first reports reached his office. He ordered his staff to reconstruct the entire sequence of events minute by minute, beginning with the moment Laura arrived at the venue. Every access point was examined. Every name on the guest list was compared against the electronic records. The palace wanted to know whether the breach had been careless, deliberate, or connected to something larger. A senior official admitted that Laura's access had been approved shortly before the event. The explanation was that the invitation had been treated as a special request and that nobody expected her to approach Princess Anne directly. William rejected that explanation immediately. In his view, allowing an unapproved person into a controlled royal engagement was not a misunderstanding. It was a failure of judgment with institutional consequences. He demanded to know who had authorized the exception. The room went quiet. One name eventually emerged, followed by another. Staff discovered that the regional official had communicated with an employee connected to Camilla's household before the invitation was issued. Nothing conclusively proved that the confrontation itself had been planned, but the connection was enough to trigger a much deeper review. William then turned his attention to the financial dispute Laura had raised. If she had come specifically to challenge estate decisions, he wanted to understand what information she believed she possessed. The existing audit was confidential, yet Laura had referred to details that should not have been widely known. That suggested a possible leak. The investigation widened. Anne, meanwhile, was returning from the event with her staff. She remained unusually quiet, replaying every part of the confrontation in her mind. Why had Laura arrived when she did? Who knew and would be there? And why had several journalists appeared unusually prepared to record the incident? And requested the full attendee list. She studied it carefully and began identifying people who might have known about the estate review. The pattern did not provide a definitive answer, but it raised enough questions to justify further investigation. Back at the palace, William's team discovered that confidential information had been discussed through several private communications shortly before the event. The messages did not prove wrongdoing, but their timing was difficult to ignore. William ordered a complete review of the relevant correspondence. He also instructed his advisors to separate the family dispute from the institutional problem. He did not want an emotional response. He wanted evidence. If somebody had manipulated access, leaked confidential information, or used royal connections to influence decisions, he wanted the facts established before any punishment was imposed. The palace could survive another unpleasant family argument. What it could not easily survive was evidence that internal procedures had been deliberately weakened. By midnight, William had a preliminary report on his desk. It showed multiple points where ordinary safeguards had been bypassed. None alone explained the entire incident. Together, however, they suggested that several people had become comfortable operating outside the normal chain of command. William read the report twice. Then he asked for the names of everyone involved. The old and formal arrangements were disappearing. William made his position clear. Nobody was to brief the press, speculate publicly, or attempt to settle the matter through private favors. The investigation would continue quietly, and every conclusion would be based on documented evidence. She had spent decades dealing with the pressures of royal life, and she understood that public anger could easily distract from the real issue. Her concern was the integrity of the institution. She wanted to know whether confidential estate information had been exposed and whether anyone had attempted to manipulate the palace's decision-making process. Her own review produced another important clue. One of the documents connected to the estate audit had been accessed earlier than expected. The access was technically authorized, but the timing suggested that somebody outside the immediate audit team may have been monitoring developments and passed the information to William rather than confronting anyone herself. That decision brought the two investigations together. William's staff began comparing the document access records with the communication history surrounding Laura's invitation. The overlap was not enough to establish a conspiracy, but it was enough to reveal a network of contacts that had previously gone unnoticed. At the center of the questions was Camilla's wider circle. Nobody could yet prove that Camilla herself had ordered anything. That distinction became increasingly important as the investigation continued. William wanted to avoid turning suspicion into accusation. His objective was to determine whether members of her household had improperly influenced palace operations. Meanwhile, Laura was facing the consequences of the confrontation. What had begun as an attempt to challenge decisions affecting her family had become a public controversy. Her advisors urged her to remain silent while the palace reviewed the incident. Every interview request was declined. Every proposed public statement was reconsidered. Inside the palace, William prepared a series of administrative changes designed to prevent another breach. Invitations connected to sensitive royal engagements would receive additional review. Regional officials would face stricter approval requirements, and staff with personal connections to outside households would be required to disclose potential conflicts. William then met privately with the king and presented the findings. He explained that the confrontation itself was only one part of the problem. The more serious concern was the possibility that confidential information had moved through unofficial channels and that palace procedures had been treated as flexible when they should have been absolute. The king listened carefully. No dramatic confrontation followed. No public declaration was made. Instead, the king approved a deeper review of the household's internal arrangements and authorized William to continue tightening the procedures around royal engagements and confidential financial matters. For Laura and the people around her, that decision represented a major shift. The palace had discovered weaknesses that could no longer be ignored, and had begun tracing the source of a possible information leak, and William had taken control of the response. The question now was no longer whether the incident would disappear. It was who would be exposed when the investigation reached its final name. The palace had barely finished reviewing the evidence when another development changed the entire situation. A sealed envelope arrived at Laura Lopes' residence, delivered by a solicitor acting on behalf of the family. Inside was a blunt warning. She was instructed not to speak publicly, contact reporters, or publish anything about the confrontation. Any attempt to do so could create consequences far more serious than the original incident. Laura read the letter twice. For the first time, she understood that the situation was no longer simply about an argument with Princess Anne. William's investigation had reached deeper into the family's connections, and several financial and administrative questions were now being examined. Accounts, property arrangements, and previous communications were all being reviewed. Then another message arrived. A financial contact Laura had relied on for years was suddenly unavailable. Calls went unanswered, emails were returned, and the usual access to information had disappeared. She realized that the palace was no longer waiting for the controversy to fade. The entire structure surrounding her family was being examined from the inside out. Days later, William entered a private meeting with the king carrying the final recommendations from his team. There was no dramatic speech. Instead, he placed several documents across the table and explained that the palace needed stronger restrictions around unofficial influence, sensitive information, and access to royal engagements. The king studied the papers carefully before approving the proposed changes. The decision sent a message throughout the household. The old system of informal favors was finished. When the consequences finally reached Camilla's family, there was no public confrontation. No angry statement appeared. No furious demand for an audience followed. The silence was almost more revealing than an argument would have been. William stood alone for several moments after the meeting, looking across the palace courtyard. He had stopped the immediate crisis. But one question remained unanswered. Who had originally leaked the information that brought Laura to Princess Anne's door? Because if the confrontation had been connected to something larger, then removing one person would solve nothing. The palace had closed one door. Somewhere inside, another one was already opening. And if William discovers who was behind it, the next revelation could change everything. If you want to know what happens next, stay with this story, because the most important secret may not have been uncovered yet.